Hello, scholars. Mr. Long signing on here. Today for World History 2, we're going to be taking a quick look at the Franco-Prussian War. In general, a lesser-known war from the 19th century, at least here in the United States. The Franco-Prussian War is incredibly significant in regards to European history because this is going to help bridge the gap between the old school Napoleonic way of fighting and the more modern era of World War I. So we're going to see some technological developments changing the way wars are fought. This is also going to be a significant war in the geopolitical Europe during the 19th century with the unification of the German Empire, again, setting the stage for the upcoming World War I and the drama that takes place there. So let's go ahead and get started. Today's agenda, we're going to go over the background of the war, the belligerents, so who was involved, little few details about the war itself, how the war was fought, the Treaty of Versailles, and the outcomes of this war as they pertain to us here in World History 2. Background of the war. In the years leading up to 1870, the year that the war is going to start, Prussian Otto von Bismarck made progress unifying the German states. Otto von Bismarck, he is an incredibly influential politician from the German state of Prussia. As we're going into the Franco-Prussian War, there isn't a German nation. There really isn't a German country yet. You have various principalities and kingdoms and nation states that speak German, are culturally German, but they're not quite unified yet. When we looked at nationalism in Europe, some of this combining of the German principalities into a nation state, much like what we saw in Italy during the 19th century, we should have been exploring that there and here. This is the very, very, very tail end of that nationalism combining these countries, with Bismarck being the key fella making this happen. On the map, if you're looking at the map over here, Prussia is going to be this weird blue squiggly, and the area that is going to make up Germany is going to include what was then Prussia, as well as some of these southern nations and principalities down here between Germany and Italy. If you're thinking of the modern map of Germany, those areas down there are now part of Germany. And it is during this war that we're going to see these other principalities become part of what becomes Germany. So back to the background. The French grew increasingly concerned by this increasingly more powerful neighbor. Wow, he's increasingly twice. Good job, Mr. Long. The French people are looking at the rising state of Prussia as a threat, as a new contender. Prussia just beat the snot out of the Austrians in the Austro-Prussian War, I believe it was called. And so the French are growing a little concerned that there's this rising military power that may upset the delicate balance of powers established by the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars. One of the key events that's going to start this war is going to be the country of Spain down here on the Iberian Peninsula on our map. Spain is going to have a bit of a succession crisis where they don't know who the next monarch is going to be. They're actually looking outside of Spain to bring in a foreign person with royal blood to kind of take over the monarchy of Spain, as European nations do sometimes because, you know, it's weird or whatever. We'll get into that more later on another day, rather. So during the secession crisis, a Prussian prince, who I left the name out because we don't really need to know who this is, a Prussian prince is going to be nominated to the throne of Spain. I misspelled the word throne, forgive me. So I'm going to go ahead and correct that. It should be Throne. There we go. Throne. That's how it should be spelled. To the throne of Spain. The French do not like this idea at all. They see the rising state of Prussia to their east, France being over here, this big purple country in the middle. So they don't like what's going on over here. And if a Prussian prince becomes a king of Spain, France will have German monarchs that are friendly because they're both Prussians on their eastern side with Prussia and on their western side with Spain, which nobody likes to be surrounded by hostile forces. So the French grow concerned. The French are going to send a diplomat to Prussia saying, don't you dare do this. And the Prussian government is going to back down. They don't let the Prussian prince go to Spain to take over as power. However, Otto von Bismarck sees an opportunity here And what he does is he tweaks the transcript of this meeting and lets it be mistranslated to make it look like the Prussians were more rude to the diplomat than they were in reality. And he leaks this to the press, kind of like some misinformation, to let the French people get all upset. So the French people get all upset. They feel like their ambassador was disrespected, and they start to demand war, fueled more and more by their newspapers and by their media, fueling this anti-Prussian hysteria. By July of 1870, the French government declares war on Prussia, and we are off to the races. So, comparing the two sides here, the two different belligerents, let's talk a little bit about the French Empire. The French Empire, this is a mere 50 or 60 years after Napoleon Bonaparte, and France is still considered one of the top tier nations of the world, and they're going to continue to be after, but this is going to be a big blow. So going into this war, they are considered top tier. This is your varsity level European world power. They have a large and powerful army on paper, and though it is huge and powerful, it looks better on paper than it will actually perform for a variety of reasons. The army is made up of mostly of conscripts and former conscripts who have left the military. They're still on reserve status, so they can be called back up in a pinch or in the declaration of war. However, most of these conscripts, these draftees, are pulled from the lower classes of society, whereas the wealthy can kind of buy their way out or just dodge the draft in general, which leaves a lot of the poor Frenchmen bearing the brunt of the military service. The French army is armed with the breech-loading, I'm going to mispronounce that because I don't speak French, the chase pot. I'm sure someone can correct me later. This was a breech-loading weapon that had a shorter reload time than your traditional muzzle loading, think like musket from the American Civil War. This was a weapon that was a lot faster to reload and fire. Given this is the 1870s, so this is just 10 years after the American Civil War, where they were still using muzzle-loading rifles. So the chess-pot is a pretty advanced rifle for the time. The French army also has the mitrailleuse. Don't judge my French, I apologize. This is an early version of a modern machine gun where you kind of put 100 rifle rounds and fire them all at once like a giant shotgun. And this is going to be a pretty intimidating weapon compared to the technology at the time. However, the French keep this a secret, and they keep it such a secret that when the original crews of these weapons are killed in combat or captured, no one else really knows how to work these weapons, and now they're just sitting on the sidelines, not able to contribute to the war. By the time the war is over, the French will mobilize around 2 million soldiers, so this is a very large war for the European continent just from the French side. The North German Confederation, this is the Confederation of German states led by Prussia. This is the confederation that will become the German Empire after the war. Spoiler alert. But Prussia being the main powerhouse of that region kind of unifies all these countries. The North German Confederation is going to be allied by the Southern German states. Those are the states that I showed on the previous slide that are going to team up with the Germans against the French. The German system of conscription was more thorough and evenly distributed among the citizens, where the wealthy and the rich and the well-educated were also drafted, typically in officer roles, but still they were involved in the military, so it created more of a good blend of academics and like the rich and the poor working together and kind of creating this unified stance, whereas with the French army, it was almost exclusively the poor being drafted, and so there's going to be people disgruntled between the poor and the rich in the French military. But so the German military is more unified than the French military, and they have more to gain here. The German small arms were inferior to the French chase-pot. However, the German artillery is going to be superior to the French artillery. The German artillery is faster to load, has a longer range, it can fire larger projectiles, and so the German artillery in general can, I think it's called the Krupp gun, K-R-U-P-P-E. The Krupp gun can outclass any of the French artillery, so that's going to be the great equalizer for the Germans, where the Germans kind of win head-to-head artillery, but the French win head-to-head in small arms. Prussian officers were trained to take the initiative and take decisive action on their own. This is going to be key, especially as the war with this technology starts to break down the large Napoleonic American Civil War style fighting where everyone gets shoulder to shoulder and they're marching against each other. That's on its way out. And with smaller groups of men moving independently on the battlefield, think like World War II or Vietnam, the officers that can make those take charge and make decisive action happen, they're the ones that are going to be successful on this more modern battlefield of the 1870s. By the war's end, the Germans are going to mobilize almost 1.5 million men, so not as many as the French. However, the German military is going to be able to be better used, even with smaller numbers, to defeat the French. The war itself, I'm not going to talk about all the battles and the sieges that happened, though they are pretty interesting, at least for me. So I'm going to focus on some of the big brushstrokes as well as one key engagement here. As the war is winding up, the Prussians were able to mobilize more efficiently. Think like German engineering, they're very specific with their timetables. So they're able to mobilize very quickly, where the French are more lumbering, getting ready for this war. This is going to force the French into a preemptive strike. They're going to try to attack the Prussians earlier, before the French are truly ready, because they see the Germans gathering more strength more quickly than the French are, and that's going to kind of backfire. The Prussians are going to use railroads to outmaneuver the more road-bound French military. The Prussians are able to take their soldiers, transport them to where they're needed most in a more quickly fashion, whereas the French have to kind of walk there and it takes longer and they're not able to redeploy as efficiently. The Battle of Sedan in September of 1870, this is going to see the complete capture of an entire French army of about, I believe, 100,000 men. They're all going to be surrounded and captured, surrounded in large part because the Prussians are able to use the railroad system to get troops around the city of Sedan and put them behind the French so the French can't escape and kind of cut them off there. The French army is going to surrender, and with this French army is the French Emperor Napoleon III himself, a relative of the Napoleon Bonaparte. And with the capture of the French Emperor, this is going to start to go downhill very quickly for the French. And the French are going to continue to soldier on for several more months without their emperor, which is this guy up here. This is Napoleon hanging out with Otto von Bismarck after the Battle of Sedan. But with the French head of state captured by the Prussians, there's not a whole lot the French are going to be able to do to turn the tide of the war very quickly. After the Battle of Sedan and the humiliating defeat of the French military by the Prussians, Prussia and her allies are going to advance on Paris, the capital of France, and lay siege to the city itself. And they're going to lay siege to the city for September, October, November, December, January, so 5 months. Laying siege to the city where starvation and disease are going to run rampant around Paris, causing the civilian population to suffer horribly during this time. The suffering of the Parisians during the siege is going to force the French government to sue for peace. And over an extended period of time, the French are going to ask for an armistice, be granted the armistice or like a ceasefire as they start to finalize, or at least start working on and then finalize what becomes the Treaty of Versailles. So by this point, the French military is thoroughly defeated. The government is capitulating. They're ready to surrender. And let's bring about the end of the war. Oh, before we bring about the end of the war, some of the key notes for how the war was fought, spread around various battles during the campaigns. The French repeating rifle, the chesspot, it inflicts heavy casualties on the Germans because they're able to fire far more quickly. They can put more lead down range, inflicting heavy casualties on the Germans. However, the Prussian and the German Krupp gun, the big artillery piece, was able to equalize their inferiority in small arms in some way by lobbing large shells over long distances to destroy French positions and drive their armies back before the rifles were even brought into effect. So superior artillery countered the rifles pretty effectively for the Germans. Cavalry charges, old school like sabers on horses and lances and whatnot, still occurred during this war, so this is still a thing. You have a mixed bag with the cavalry engagements. I've read stories where cavalry was able to successfully charge enemy units and force them from the field or capture large numbers of the enemy. The speed of the horse gives them an advantage over the foot soldiers. So this success keeps the idea of keeping cavalry around in the minds of military officers. And it seems like for every story of success from the cavalry, there's one where you have cavalry charging into enemy artillery positions and just being absolutely annihilated. These glorious death charges that are going to become all too common in the first year of World War I. But unfortunately for those cavalrymen later on, there were enough successes during this war that the commanders felt they needed to maintain a cavalry corps for future conflicts. This was a war of maneuver. We don't really have the trench warfare as thoroughly as we see with World War I. The Prussians make fantastic use of railroads to outmaneuver and outpace the French army, allowing them to get the upper hand and defeat them in several key engagements. The war itself included various sieges of strongholds. I believe there was a siege of Metz. The more famous one, at least for ending the war, is a siege of Paris that I talked about on the previous slide. And so you have a pretty good mix of wars of maneuver, frontal assaults on defended positions, and prolonged sieges, such as the 5-month siege of Paris. One interesting thing is this is still during the time where militaries really kind of got dressed up in their Sunday best, and the uniform choices were very stylish during this war. In the top picture, you can see the Prussian military helmets with the pickelhelms, with the spike on top that you're going to continue to see up through World War I before they start to streamline that and simplify it and go to something more functional rather than fashionable. The French, they've got awesome red pants. I'm not going to lie. The French uniform is just so stinking classy with their blue jackets and red pants. But if you're trying to hide in the woods during a firefight, I don't think I would want to be wearing red pants. Treaty of Versailles. This is the treaty that's going to end the war itself, signed in 1871. Some of the key things here is going to be the treaty is going to formally recognize the newly unified German Empire. So like I said at the beginning of this video, before this war, there is no German country. You have various city-states with Prussia gaining more and more power, absorbing others through allegiances or alliances and conquest. But now, after the Franco-Prussian War, we have the German Empire that we're going to see going into World War I. So this is where that comes from. The establishment of the German Empire is going to upset the balance of power established by the Congress of Vienna, which we talked about in unit, I want to say 4, after the Napoleonic War. So the Congress of Vienna of 1814-1815, where they wanted to surround France with strong enough countries that France couldn't expand outward too much, but also so that no one country was dramatically more powerful than the others, therefore kind of keeping this status quo of Europe. This German Empire is going to toss that all aside, and now these European countries are going to be scrambling around to figure out what's the new status quo, what's the new normal for Europe. France, in this defeat to the Prussians, are going to be pretty embarrassed. Not just because they lost, but also some of the things that the Prussians are going to force the French to do now that the war is over. For example, the French have to pay an indemnity, which is like paying damages to the Prussians, which is kind of weird because it's in effect the French paying the Prussians money for the privilege of getting their butt kicked, which kind of is weird, but it's paying for damages for the war to kind of make up for and also say like, hey, we won, so give me your lunch money. The amount of this indemnity is in proportion to the indemnity Napoleon forced the Prussians to pay France in 1807. So paying of indemnities for getting your butt kicked is not a new thing. This goes back time and time again throughout all of world history. For the most part, you have some level of I beat you, I get your lunch money, or I get to enslave your population and sell them for profit. I get, gold or loot from the treasury, and there's something material to be gained from the war. This is going to be something that we see after World War I with the reparations that Germany has to pay. So when we talk about the reparations that Germany has to pay, keep in mind, like, that's not really new. It's going to be a very extreme form of that after 4 years of that conflict. But the idea of paying a country for the privilege of getting your butt kicked is pretty old. Let's see. Next thing. So that was the indemnity. Another key thing is the French territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which is, if you're looking at the map over here, that's going to be this little orange section of territory between France, so it's to the east of France, and it's to the west of Germany. Alsace-Lorraine is economically valuable. It had a lot of, I want to say, mines and factories and industry. And so controlling that territory gives a good economic boost to whichever country holds it. It also pushes the border farther away from your own capital. And so if you're the Germans now, you can put forts and bases along the western edge of Alsace-Lorraine, giving you an advantage if there were to be another war. Oh, I don't know, like World War I in 1914. The French are going to be pretty upset. I mean, nobody likes to lose, but between the indemnities and losing Alsace-Lorraine, the French people are going to be very bitter, and they're going to have the sense of like revengeism, that they want to get back at the Germans later on for the humiliation of the losing the war, but also having to do all these extra things after losing. The Germans are also going to occupy for a short period of time a little chunk of France, kind of like holding it hostage until France finishes paying the indemnities, in which case the Prussian troops, the German troops, are going to head back home. So some of the outcomes of the war: this is going to end French dominance in mainland Europe, where before this point, France was kind of the bee's knees of countries. It was kind of the alpha country, the pack leader of the mainland European countries. I mean, Britain's still super powerful, but they're not really included in mainland Europe because they're off on the other side of the English Channel. But just for the continent itself, France was the most powerful. Now, the German Empire is able to compete after being unified so that France no longer can get away with whatever they want. This war is also going to result in the unification of the German Empire, with the German flag over here that we'll see all the way up through the end of World War I. Other nations began adopting the Prussian military innovations. Observers of the war were so shocked by how thoroughly the Prussian military was able to spank the French that they're going to take a lot of very thorough notes and take those notes back to their home country and incorporate some of the same ideas so that their military can be more powerful and effective. A couple of these things down here. The first one is the idea of a general staff. I didn't talk about this one earlier, but the Prussians had this idea that you have like your general and then your general staff. And so all the members of the staff have a different role and different function. You kind of allow other people to take charge of specific things so that the one person in charge has more time to focus on the mission. The French generals didn't have a general staff per se. So several of the generals kind of got overwhelmed by the amount of work that they had to do because they weren't able to allocate some of those responsibilities to other people. The second thing is universal conscription. We talked about drafting and conscription going into the war, where the French were kind of only drafting the poor. The Germans were drafting everybody, which created a more cohesive military unit where everyone knew their role and there was respect between the upper class and the lower class, between the officers and the enlisted, because everyone had to serve. The French, there was a lot of bitterness with the poor, the conscripted enlisted guys, the privates, because they didn't really trust the rich, because the rich got out of serving unless they really volunteered to do it. So the idea of conscripting everybody into the military and giving them that experience of the military so that if they do have to be called up during a war, many nations are going to adopt that principle. The third one is detailed mobilization systems. One of the things that allowed the Prussians to overcome the French was, even though the French had a larger military, it took them much longer to get everybody where they needed to be, whereas the Prussians and the Germans were able to mobilize more quickly. Mobilizing being getting people from their home to the bases, arming them, giving them their uniforms, and then sending them out to fight. So the Germans were able to kind of come out of the gate sprinting, where the French were more of a lumbering behemoth, slowly getting ready. And that speed at which the Prussians could mobilize gave them an edge because they were able to take the fight to the French in a way that they chose because they were ready first. On the military side, on the more tactical, smaller level, this war is going to initiate the transition of artillery from direct fire. Think like old Civil War, American Revolution cannons, where you have the cannons on the hill and you're overlooking like a valley or the battlefield and you're firing lead shot directly into the enemy. Like you can see them and you're shooting where you can see. Because of technological advances, especially with the Krupp gun, where you can fire a bigger shell, longer distances, and bigger shell, longer distances, and fire faster, artillery is going to be, the way artillery is used is going to change. And now, instead of firing directly over open sights at an enemy you could see, now you're lobbing shells indirectly over obstacles. So if you're on one side of a hill and they're on the other side of a hill, you can fire over the hill and still hit them. That's going to become the main way artillery is used moving forward during the war. The Prussians were also able to use artillery very aggressively, where they would, with their range, be able to fire at French positions without being shot back because of the longer range. And then they were able to use the artillery to more directly support the infantry as they advanced, where the French, with their slower cannons with lesser range, couldn't really compete. They couldn't attack the Prussian batteries, the artillery batteries, which just gave the Prussians a immeasurable advantage during the war. So that's the Franco-Prussian War. Some of the key highlights for you guys. Some of the main things I want you to focus on are those outcomes. Bringing the slide back up, especially with the unification of the German Empire and changing the balance of powers from the Congress of Vienna. This is going to really be seen directly when we get into Unit 6 and World War I and World War II, in large part because of the German Empire rivaling France, but also France feeling really bitter about this war. And they are going to remember this when war starts to break out in 1914. And it's going to cause more nationalism to be poured into the war, which is going to make the war all that much more terrible. So that's all I have for you guys today. Hopefully this was broken down for you pretty clearly. If you guys have any question, you know where to reach me in the classroom via email or on Canvas. And I believe that's all I have for you guys today, doing my mental checklist. I think I got everything I needed. If not, I'll find you guys in class. Other than that, I'm out. Mr. Long, signing out. Over out.